Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the brutal, unforgiving world of Viking winter survival, where the line between life and death wasn't just thin, it was practically invisible beneath layers of ice and snow. From ingenious insulation techniques, using everything from sheep's wool to seal fat, to communal survival strategies that would make modern preppers weep with envy, the Vikings didn't just endure the harshest winters on Earth, they thrived in them. So before we begin this journey into the frozen north, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into history's most resilient people. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what the weather's like. It's always fascinating to connect with fellow history lovers around the globe. Now settle in, maybe grab a warm blanket, and let's explore how ordinary Vikings turned survival into an art form. When you think of Vikings, you probably picture longships cutting through stormy seas, warriors with horned helmets charging into battle, or perhaps mead halls filled with boisterous feasting. But for the average Viking farmer, fisherman, or craftsman, winter wasn't about glorious raids or epic saga. It was about a 6-month battle against cold, so fierce it could kill you in your sleep. Picture this. You're living in a wooden hall somewhere in Norway or Iceland, where winter darkness lasts for months, temperatures plummet to bone, crushing lows, and the howling wind sounds like the very gods themselves are angry. No central heating, no electric lights, no grocery stores, just you, your family, and whatever preparations you managed to scrape together during the brief summer months. For Vikings, winter wasn't just a season, it was a test of everything they'd learned about survival, community, and sheer stubborn determination. If you think your studio apartment feels cramped during a winter lockdown, spare a thought for the Vikings who voluntarily designed their homes to trap 30 to 50 people together for 6 months of brutal darkness, and somehow made it work without anyone getting murdered. Well, mostly without anyone getting murdered. The Viking longhouse wasn't just architecture, it was a survival strategy disguised as a building, a fortress against winter, so ingeniously designed that modern architects still study its principles while shivering in their poorly insulated glass towers. Picture a structure that looks like someone took a massive wooden ship, flipped it upside down, and buried it halfway into the earth. That's essentially what a Viking longhouse was, except instead of sailing across oceans, it was designed to sail through the treacherous waters of Scandinavian winter. These weren't cozy little cottages with picket fences and window boxes. They were utilitarian monsters, sometimes stretching over 100 feet in length, built with the grim understanding that if you got the design wrong, everyone inside would be frozen corpses by spring. The genius of the longhouse began with its most fundamental decision: orientation. Vikings didn't just plop their homes down wherever they felt like it. They studied the land like military strategists, analyzing wind patterns, drainage, and sun exposure with the intensity of people whose lives literally depended on getting it right. The longhouse was typically aligned east to west, presenting its narrow end to the prevailing winter winds. This wasn't aesthetic choice, it was physics. A long, low profile meant the howling Arctic gales would mostly slide over the structure rather than trying to tear it apart board by board. But the real stroke of brilliance was the semi-subterranean design. Vikings dug their longhouses partially into the earth, sometimes lowering the floor level by several feet. To modern eyes, this might look like they were living in glorified bunkers, and honestly, that's not far from the truth. The earth provided natural insulation, maintaining a relatively stable temperature even when the air above ground was cold enough to freeze your breath mid-sentence. It was like having a built-in basement, except instead of storing old Christmas decorations, you were storing your entire family and hoping they'd all still be alive come spring. The walls themselves were marvels of practical engineering. Vikings used a technique called wattle and daub construction, but unlike their medieval counterparts, who slapped mud and dung together and hoped for the best, Viking builders approached it with the precision of people who knew that a single gap in the wall could mean death. The framework consisted of massive wooden posts, driven deep into the ground, connected by horizontal beams that could support the weight of the turf roof and resist the lateral pressure of winter winds. Between these posts, they wove a tight matrix of thin branches and twigs the wattle, creating a basket-like structure that was then packed with a carefully mixed daub of clay, animal hair, and organic matter. What made Viking wall construction particularly clever was their understanding of layered defense. The exterior walls weren't just single barriers, they were complex systems designed to shed water, block wind, and trap warm air. The outer layer was often covered with overlapping wooden planks or, in some regions, stones fitted together with mortar. This created a weatherproof shell that could turn aside rain, snow, and the kind of sideways driving sleet that made stepping outside feel like being attacked by tiny frozen daggers. But the Vikings didn't stop there. Inside the main wall structure, they often added an additional layer of insulation, using whatever materials were locally available. In coastal areas, this might be dried seaweed packed tight between wooden slats. Inland, they used moss, animal fur, or even dried grass bundled into tight bundles. The result was a wall system that could be 2 or 3 feet thick in some places, not because Vikings were showing off, but because they understood that thermal mass and insulation were the difference between comfort and catastrophe. The roof was perhaps the most ingenious part of the entire structure. Instead of the clay tiles or wooden shingles you might expect, Viking longhouses were crowned with living roofs made of layered turf. This wasn't just Vikings being environmentally conscious before it was cool. It was brilliant engineering disguised as rustic charm. The turf roof worked on multiple levels. It provided excellent insulation. It was naturally waterproof when properly constructed. And it was so heavy that it actually helped stabilize the entire structure against high winds. Building a turf roof was an art form that required understanding both botany and engineering. The process began with a layer of birch bark laid directly over the wooden roof beams. This bark layer served as the primary waterproof membrane, and Vikings were meticulous about overlapping the pieces to ensure no gaps. Over the bark, they laid strips of turf cut from meadows, arranged like enormous green shingles with the grass side facing up. The trick was to cut the turf thick enough to provide insulation, but not so thick that its weight would crush the roof beams. A well-built turf roof could last decades and actually improve with age as the grass roots grew together, creating an increasingly weatherproof seal. In winter, these turf roofs became living snowsheds. The grass, even when dormant, created a slightly rough surface that helped snow accumulate in a thick, insulating blanket. Instead of fighting the snow, Viking architecture embraced it, using nature's own insulation to keep the interior warm. Of course, this meant that by midwinter, the longhouse looked like a massive snow-covered hill with smoke coming out of it, which must have created some confusion for visitors who weren't sure if they were approaching a home or accidentally discovered a dragon's lair. The entrance to a Viking longhouse was designed with the paranoid attention to detail of people who knew that cold air was an enemy that never slept. Most longhouses featured double-door systems or elaborate porches that created airlocks, preventing precious warm air from escaping every time someone needed to step outside. The main doors themselves were heavy, thick affairs, often reinforced with iron hardware and designed to seal tightly against their frames. Some longhouses had multiple entrances, but the primary door was typically placed on the south-facing side when possible, taking advantage of whatever weak winter sunlight managed to penetrate the gloom. Inside, the longhouse was organized with the efficiency of a military operation and the practicality of people who understood that wasted space meant wasted heat. The central feature was the long hearth that ran down the middle of the main hall, giving the longhouse its distinctive layout. This wasn't a cozy fireplace tucked into a corner. It was a linear fire pit that could stretch for dozens of feet, designed to heat the entire length of the building. The hearth was typically lined with stones and slightly raised above the floor level, both to improve combustion and to prevent accidentally stepping into the fire during the long, dark nights when visibility was limited to whatever the flames could illuminate. Above the central hearth, the roof featured a series of openings designed to allow smoke to escape, while minimizing heat loss. This was trickier than it sounds. Too large an opening, and all your warm air disappears into the night sky. Too small, and everyone inside slowly suffocates on smoke. Vikings developed a system of adjustable roof vents, often using wooden louvers or removable panels that could be opened or closed depending on wind conditions and the intensity of the fire. On the worst winter nights, they might partially close these vents, accepting a smokier interior in exchange for retaining more heat. The floor plan of a longhouse was divided into distinct zones, each serving specific functions that contributed to winter survival. The central hall, dominated by the long hearth, was the communal space where families gathered for meals, work, and social activities. But this area was surrounded by smaller, more private spaces that served as bedrooms, workshops, and storage areas. These side chambers were often built at slightly different levels than the main hall, creating thermal zones that could be individually controlled. The sleeping areas were particularly clever in their design. Vikings understood that warm air rises, so sleeping platforms were often built several feet above the main floor level. These raised bed platforms weren't just for comfort, they positioned sleepers in the warmest air layer available. The platforms themselves were constructed like mini-rooms within the larger structure, with partial walls or hanging curtains that could trap body heat and create intimate warm spaces, even when the main hall had grown cold. Storage was integrated into the very structure of the longhouse. Vikings built storage niches, shelves, and compartments directly into the walls, utilizing every available cubic foot of space. This wasn't just about organization, it was about survival, logistics, food stores, tools, extra clothing, and fuel all needed to be accessible, even during blizzards that might last for days. By building storage into the walls, Vikings ensured that essential supplies were always within reach and protected from the elements. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of longhouse design was how it facilitated the social dynamics necessary for winter survival. The central hall was designed to accommodate large gatherings, recognizing that community cohesion was as important as physical warmth during the dark months. The space was arranged so that everyone could see and hear each other, creating an environment where stories could be shared, songs could be sung, and social bonds could be maintained, even when the outside world had become a frozen wasteland. The longhouse also addressed the practical reality that 30 or 40 people living in close quarters for months needed systems to prevent conflict and maintain order. The arrangement of spaces created natural hierarchies, with the most honored positions closest to the center of the hall and the warmest spots near the hearth. But it also provided opportunities for privacy and solitude when needed, recognizing that even the most social Vikings occasionally needed to escape the constant presence of their neighbors. Lighting inside the longhouse during winter was a constant challenge that Vikings addressed through both architectural features and ingenious improvisation. Small windows, when they existed at all, were covered with thin sheets of horn or oiled animal membranes that allowed some light to filter through while maintaining insulation. But for most of the winter, interior lighting came from the central fire, oil lamps burning seal or whale fat, and candles made from rendered animal fat. The longhouse was designed to maximize the effectiveness of these light sources, with light-colored interior walls that reflected whatever illumination was available and strategic placement of work areas near the brightest spots. The construction process itself revealed the Viking understanding of community survival. Building a longhouse wasn't a family project. It was a community effort that required coordinated labor from multiple households. The massive timber framework required teams of workers to position and secure the heavy beams. The turf cutting and roof laying demanded carefully orchestrated group effort. Even the ongoing maintenance of the longhouse throughout the winter required collective participation. This collaborative approach to construction created buildings that were not just individually owned shelters, but community assets that everyone had invested in, and everyone had reason to protect. Viking longhouses also demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of materials, science, even if they wouldn't have called it that. Vikings knew which types of wood were best for different structural elements: oak for the main posts that needed to bear heavy loads, pine for the roof beams that needed to be strong but lightweight, birch for the flexible elements that needed to bend without breaking. They understood how different woods behaved in wet and dry conditions, how they expanded and contracted with temperature changes, and how to join them together in ways that would remain strong through decades of seasonal stress. The longhouse represented something more profound than just clever architecture. It embodied a philosophy of survival that acknowledged both human vulnerability and human ingenuity. Vikings understood that individual heroics, while useful for raiding and saga-making, were worthless against the systematic assault of winter weather. The longhouse was designed around the recognition that survival required community, that comfort required sacrifice, and that making it through the dark months required planning, cooperation, and a willingness to live closely with your neighbors, whether you particularly liked them or not. Modern visitors to reconstructed Viking longhouses often comment on how dark, smoky, and cramped they feel compared to contemporary homes. This misses the point entirely. The longhouse wasn't designed for comfort by modern standards. It was designed to keep its inhabitants alive through conditions that would kill modern people, equipped with central heating and emergency services. The darkness wasn't a flaw. It conserved fuel and encouraged people to sleep more during the months when there was little daylight anyway. The smokiness wasn't poor ventilation. It was a calculated trade-off between air quality and heat retention. The cramped quarters weren't bad planning. They were recognition that shared body heat and forced social interaction were survival tools in their own right. The Viking longhouse stands as perhaps one of history's most successful examples of architecture designed specifically for extreme environmental survival. It wasn't built to impress visitors or showcase wealth. It was built to function under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Every beam, every wall, every seemingly minor detail was chosen and positioned with the understanding that a single design flaw could mean the difference between a family emerging healthy in spring or not emerging at all. In a world where modern buildings struggle to maintain comfortable temperatures with billions of dollars worth of technology, the Viking longhouse achieved thermal efficiency using nothing but wood, mud, grass, and the accumulated wisdom of people who understood that sometimes the best way to beat nature is to work with it rather than against it. If you think keeping your thermostat at a reasonable setting during winter is a challenge, consider the Vikings, who turned the simple act of staying warm into a complex art form involving whale blubber, strategic dung placement, and a relationship with fire so intimate it bordered on the religious. For them, heat wasn't just comfort, it was the thin, flickering line between life and a very stylish, frozen death. While modern people panic when the power goes out for a few hours, Vikings spent 6 months of every year locked in mortal combat with cold, so brutal it could turn your breath into ice crystals and your morning coffee into a popsicle before you could take your first sip. Assuming, of course, they had coffee, which they didn't, which probably made the whole experience even more miserable. The Viking approach to winter heating was born from a simple, terrifying reality. In the far north, fuel was precious, winter was long, and mistakes were fatal. They couldn't just flip a switch or adjust a dial. Every BTU of heat had to be earned through careful planning, ingenious improvisation, and a willingness to burn things that would make modern environmental activists weep into their organic hemp handkerchiefs. Vikings understood that fire wasn't just a tool, it was a demanding, temperamental deity that required constant attention, regular sacrifices, and the kind of respect usually reserved for sharp weapons and angry sea gods. Wood, the obvious choice for fuel, presented the first great challenge of Viking heating strategy. In the forests of Norway and Sweden, timber was plentiful during summer, But by winter, it became a carefully rationed resource, more valuable than silver. Vikings couldn't just wander outside and grab fallen branches when the mood struck them. They had to plan their wood consumption with the mathematical precision of people who understood that running out of fuel in February meant becoming a cautionary tale for future generations. The quality of wood mattered enormously. Green wood, still full of moisture, would burn reluctantly while producing clouds of steam and very little heat, like trying to warm yourself with a damp towel. Seasoned hardwood, dried for at least a year, was the premium fuel that burned hot and long, but it required foresight and storage space that not every household could manage. Vikings developed sophisticated techniques for wood preparation that would impress modern survivalists. They understood that splitting wood didn't just make it easier to handle, it exposed more surface area to air, accelerating the drying process and creating kindling of various sizes for different purposes. Large logs were split and stored under cover for the following winter, while smaller pieces were prepared for immediate use. They learned to identify the best trees for fuel birch, for quick, hot fires, oak for long-burning coals, pine for emergency situations when you needed flame more than heat. The annual rhythm of woodcutting, splitting, and storing became as regular and essential as planting crops, except the harvest was measured not in bushels, but in degrees of warmth. But wood alone couldn't sustain a Viking household through the endless dark months. This is where Viking ingenuity became truly impressive and slightly disturbing. Faced with fuel scarcity, they turned to alternative energy sources that modern people would find either fascinating or revolting, depending on their tolerance for creative problem-solving. Animal dung, for instance, wasn't just an unfortunate byproduct of livestock ownership. It was premium fuel, carefully collected, dried, and stored like precious cargo. Cow dung, horse manure, and sheep droppings all burned with surprising efficiency once properly prepared, providing steady heat that could last for hours. The smell, admittedly, was not what you'd call pleasant, but when the alternative was freezing to death, olfactory considerations took a distant second place to thermal necessity. The process of preparing dung for fuel required both timing and technique. Fresh manure was useless as fuel too wet, too smelly, and more likely to smolder than burn. But dung that had been dried in the sun during summer months, sometimes mixed with straw or dried grass to improve combustion, could burn almost as well as wood. Vikings became connoisseurs of dung quality, able to distinguish between the fast-burning heat of horse manure and the slow, steady warmth provided by cow dung. It was a skill that wouldn't look impressive on a modern resume, but in the context of Viking winter survival, it was the difference between life and a particularly undignified death. In coastal regions, Vikings discovered even more exotic fuel sources that made dung seem positively conventional. Whale oil and seal fat became the premium heating fuels of the Arctic, providing intense, long-lasting heat that could warm a longhouse for hours with just a small amount of fuel. But acquiring these marine energy sources required either successful whaling expeditions or extensive trade networks. Whale oil wasn't something you could just pick up at the local market. A single whale could provide enough oil to heat a village for months, making whaling not just a source of food and materials, but a critical energy industry that determined whether entire communities would survive the winter. The use of whale oil for heating revealed the sophisticated understanding Vikings had developed about different types of fuel and their properties. Whale oil burned with a clean, bright flame that produced minimal smoke, huge advantage in the enclosed spaces of longhouses where air quality was always a concern. Unlike wood fires that required constant feeding and attention, oil-fed flames could burn steadily for hours with minimal tending. The oil was typically burned in large stone or iron braziers, placed strategically around the longhouse, creating multiple heat sources that could warm different areas independently. Seal fat offered similar advantages, but was more readily available to coastal communities that couldn't mount full whaling expeditions. Seals could be hunted year-round through ice holes, providing a renewable source of both food and fuel throughout the winter months. The fat was rendered down into oil that could be stored in sealed containers and used as needed. Vikings developed techniques for purifying and storing seal oil that kept it from going rancid, ensuring their fuel supplies remained effective throughout the long winter. The process involved heating the fat slowly to separate the pure oil from any remaining meat or tissue, then storing it in waterproof containers that protected it from contamination. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of Viking heating technology was their mastery of fire management itself. Keeping a fire alive for 6 months isn't just a matter of throwing wood on the flames whenever they start to die down. It requires understanding the science of combustion, the art of fuel management, and the psychology of fire behavior under different conditions. Vikings developed techniques that modern survivalists study with admiration and occasionally disbelief. The central hearth of a Viking longhouse wasn't just a fire pit. It was a carefully engineered heating system designed to maximize heat output while minimizing fuel consumption. The hearth was typically lined with stones chosen not just for their fire resistance, but for their heat retention properties. These stones would absorb heat during active burning periods and continue radiating warmth long after the flames had died down, extending the effective heating time of each fuel load. Vikings understood that the thermal mass of the hearthstones was as important as the fire itself in maintaining comfortable temperatures. Firebanking became an art form that required both technical skill and almost supernatural timing. The goal was to maintain enough heat to keep the fire alive while conserving fuel during the long nighttime hours when everyone was asleep. Vikings would carefully arrange unburned logs over a bed of hot coals, then cover the entire assembly with ash to control the airflow and slow the combustion process. Done correctly, this would keep the coals alive until morning, while producing just enough heat to prevent the longhouse from becoming a frozen tomb. Done incorrectly, you woke up to cold ashes and the cheerful prospect of trying to restart a fire with numb fingers in a house that had dropped to sub-freezing temperatures overnight. The timing of firebanking was critical and required intimate knowledge of how different fuels behaved under controlled combustion conditions. Too much airflow, and the banked fire would burn through the night's fuel supply in a few hours, leaving the household cold and fuel poor. Too little air, and the fire would die completely, requiring the dangerous and difficult process of restarting from scratch in freezing conditions. Vikings developed almost mystical abilities to judge the correct balance, arranging the fuel and ash with the precision of people who understood that their lives literally depended on getting it right. Maintaining multiple heat sources became standard practice in larger longhouses where a single central fire couldn't effectively warm the entire space. Vikings would establish secondary heating points using portable braziers, small fire bowls, or even heated stones that could be moved around as needed. These auxiliary heat sources were particularly important in sleeping areas and workshops where people needed focused warmth for specific activities. Managing multiple fires required coordinated effort and careful fuel allocation, ensuring that no single heat source consumed so much fuel that others were left cold. The conservation of fuel throughout the winter required planning that would impress modern energy managers. Vikings developed rationing systems that allocated fuel based on the expected length and severity of winter, the size of the household, and the available fuel supplies. They learned to stretch their energy resources by using different fuels at different times, burning the most efficient materials during the coldest periods, and relying on lower-grade fuels during milder weather. This wasn't just practical economics, it was survival mathematics, where a miscalculation in fuel consumption could result in running out of heat during the most dangerous part of winter. Storage of fuel required both engineering and logistics skills that Vikings developed through necessity and refined through generations of experience. Wood had to be kept dry and accessible even during blizzards that could bury fuel piles under feet of snow. Dung and other alternative fuels needed protection from moisture while remaining easy to retrieve during emergencies. Oil and fat required containers that wouldn't leak or contaminate the fuel, storage locations that wouldn't freeze solid, and inventory systems that tracked consumption and remaining supplies. The social aspects of fuel management revealed how deeply heating strategies were integrated into Viking community life. Fuel gathering, preparation, and allocation became communal activities that required cooperation and shared responsibility. Woodcutting expeditions were organized as group efforts where multiple families worked together to harvest and process timber for everyone's use. The sharing of fuel during emergencies wasn't just neighborly kindness. It was insurance against the kind of heating failures that could kill entire households. Vikings also developed backup heating strategies for situations when primary fuel sources failed or were depleted. They learned to burn furniture, structural timber, and even personal possessions when necessary to maintain life-sustaining heat. While this might seem wasteful or desperate, it represented a clear-eyed understanding of survival priorities. Better to sit on the floor and live than to preserve your favorite chair and freeze to death in it. They also developed emergency heating techniques using body heat, shared bedding, and group warming that could sustain life even without fire, though these methods were uncomfortable and couldn't be maintained for extended periods. The psychological aspects of Viking heating management were as important as the technical ones. Fire represented security, comfort, and survival, but it also required constant vigilance and anxiety about fuel supplies. Vikings had to balance the natural human desire for warmth and comfort against the rational need to conserve resources for the months ahead. This created a complex relationship with heat, where every moment of extra warmth had to be weighed against the possibility of running out of fuel later. The stress of fuel management was a constant undercurrent of winter life, a nagging worry that colored every decision about when to add more wood, when to bank the fire, and when to simply endure the cold to save fuel for later. Innovation in heating technology continued throughout Viking culture as different communities developed solutions adapted to their specific resources and challenges. Coastal communities became experts in marine fuel sources, developing techniques for processing whale, oil, and seal fat that maximized both heating efficiency and storage life. Inland communities focused on wood and alternative biomass fuels, creating sophisticated systems for fuel preparation and storage. These regional variations in heating technology reflected the Viking ability to adapt their survival strategies to local conditions while maintaining the core principles of fuel conservation and fire management. The tools and equipment associated with Viking heating were as carefully crafted and maintained as their weapons or ships. Fire pokers, bellows, tongs, and fuel containers were essential equipment that received regular attention and repair. Vikings understood that heating equipment failure during winter could be fatal, so they maintained backup tools and replacement parts for critical heating systems. The quality of fire-making equipment, flint and steel, tinder boxes, kindling supplies was carefully monitored and maintained throughout the winter months. Testing and quality control of fuel became routine practices that modern industrial engineers would recognize and approve. Vikings learned to test wood moisture content, evaluate the burning characteristics of different dung preparations, and assess the quality of oil and fat fuels before committing them to storage. They developed methods for identifying contaminated or degraded fuels that could cause heating problems or dangerous indoor air pollution. This quality consciousness wasn't perfectionism, it was recognition that substandard fuel during a blizzard could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. The legacy of Viking heating technology influenced subsequent Northern European heating practices for centuries after the Viking Age ended. Many of the techniques for fuel preparation, fire management, and alternative energy sources that Vikings developed were passed down through generations and adapted by later cultures facing similar environmental challenges. The fundamental principles of fuel conservation, fire banking, and backup heating strategies that Vikings mastered became standard practices in cold climate survival that remain relevant even in the modern era. Today, when heating bills cause modern families to consider wearing sweaters indoors, or when power outages leave us temporarily without central heating, it's worth remembering the Vikings, who faced 6 months of darkness with nothing but their wits, their carefully hoarded fuel supplies, and their hard-won knowledge of how to coax warmth from whale fat and dried manure. They didn't just survive winter, they created a heating technology so sophisticated and effective that it sustained entire communities through conditions that would challenge modern heating systems. In an age of smart thermostats and efficient furnaces, there's something both humbling and inspiring about the Viking approach to staying warm. It required intelligence, cooperation, and the kind of resourcefulness that turns cow dung into salvation and whale oil into the difference between life and death. If you think choosing the right outfit for a chilly morning is complicated, imagine the Vikings, who turned getting dressed into a tactical operation that could determine whether they'd make it through the day with all their extremities still attached. While modern people agonize over whether to wear a light jacket or a heavy coat, Vikings were orchestrating elaborate layering symphonies that involved everything from linen underwear to sealskin boots, sheep's wool sweaters to bearskin cloaks, all calibrated with the precision of people who understood that one miscalculation in fabric choice could result in becoming a very stylish ice sculpture by lunchtime. Their approach to winter clothing wasn't fashionate, was armor against an enemy that never slept, never retreated, and showed no mercy to the poorly dressed. The Viking mastery of layering began with a fundamental understanding that would make modern outdoor gear manufacturers weep with envy. The human body is a walking furnace that produces heat, but only if you know how to trap, manage, and conserve that heat effectively. Vikings didn't have synthetic fabrics, moisture-wicking technology, or thermal ratings printed on convenient tags. What they had was centuries of accumulated wisdom about which animal fibers worked best in specific conditions, how different materials behaved when wet, and the precise art of wearing multiple layers without ending up looking like an overstuffed sausage who couldn't bend their arms. The foundation of any Viking winter outfit was the undergarment system, and here they demonstrated sophistication that would surprise anyone who imagines them as unwashed barbarians stumbling around in crude animal skins. The base layer, worn directly against the skin, was typically made of linen choice that reveals deep understanding of textile science, even if they wouldn't have called it that. Linen, despite feeling cool to the touch, possessed magical properties for winter survival. It absorbed moisture from the skin while maintaining insulation. It dried quickly when conditions allowed, and it could be washed and maintained relatively easily, even with primitive soap and limited hot water. These linen undergarments weren't simple tunics thrown together by someone who'd never seen a needle before. Viking seamstresses, and yes, they were primarily women despite the popular image of Vikings as exclusively male warriors, created fitted undergarments with carefully planned seams, strategic reinforcements, and thoughtful details like longer sleeves and extended torsos that prevented gaps between layers. The linen undershirt was typically long enough to tuck securely into trousers, eliminating the kind of wardrobe malfunctions that could expose bare skin to Arctic air. The underpants, called brays, were designed with drawstring waists and fitted legs that provided coverage without bulk, allowing the outer layers to fit properly without creating pressure points or circulation problems. Over the linen base layer came the wool revolution, and here Vikings demonstrated their genius for identifying and exploiting the perfect winter fiber. Wool wasn't just available and warm. It was nature's answer to almost every challenge that winter clothing needed to solve. Wool retained insulation even when wet. It was naturally antibacterial. It could be processed into different weights and textures for different purposes. And it was renewable as long as you kept your sheep alive and happy. Vikings didn't just use wool, they became wool virtuosos, developing techniques for processing, spinning, and weaving that produced everything from gossamer light undergarments to thick, weather-resistant outer fabrics. The wool tunic, worn over the linen base layer, was the workhorse of Viking winter clothing. These weren't the crude, scratchy affairs that modern people associate with primitive textiles. Viking wool tunics were carefully constructed garments, with fitted sleeves, shaped bodies, and finishing details that revealed both technical skill and aesthetic sensibility. The wool was often dyed in rich colors, using natural materials: reds from madder root, blues from woad, yellows from various plants, creating garments that served both practical and social functions. A well-made wool tunic announced that its wearer belonged to a household that could afford quality materials and skilled craftsmanship. But the real brilliance of Viking layering became apparent in their approach to the outer shell, the final barrier between the human body and the hostile environment outside. This outer layer had to be windproof, water-resistant, and tough enough to withstand the kind of abuse that came from daily life, in a world where everything from chopping wood to feeding livestock happened outdoors, regardless of weather conditions. Vikings solved this challenge through careful selection of materials and construction techniques that created garments capable of turning aside everything from driving sleet to grabbing thorns. The classic Viking cloak represented the pinnacle of their outerwear technology. These weren't simple blankets thrown over the shoulders. They were engineering marvels disguised as clothing. The best cloaks were made from tightly woven wool that had been Falida process, that involved controlled shrinking and compacting of the fabric that created a material so dense it was nearly waterproof. The fulling process required expertise, timing, and considerable physical effort, but the result was a fabric that could shed rain like a duck's back while maintaining breathability and flexibility. For extreme conditions, Vikings turned to fur-lined cloaks that combined the weather resistance of fulled wool with the insulation properties of animal pelts. These premium garments required both skilled hunters and expert furriers who understood how to prepare and attach different types of fur for maximum effectiveness. Bear fur provided ultimate warmth, but was heavy and expensive. Wolf fur offered excellent insulation with lighter weight, but was harder to obtain. Sheep and goat fur were more readily available, but required careful processing to achieve the desired insulation properties. The construction of a fur-lined cloak was a masterpiece of medieval tailoring that required planning and precision. The outer shell had to be cut and sewn to accommodate the bulk of the fur lining without creating an unwieldy garment that restricted movement. The fur had to be carefully matched for color and texture, then attached with seaming techniques that prevented gaps where cold air could penetrate. The result was a garment that could keep its wearer warm in conditions that would challenge modern winter gear, but only if worn by someone who understood how to manage its bulk and weight effectively. Viking legwear presented particular challenges because the lower body was constantly exposed to snow, mud, and wet conditions, while remaining mobile enough for daily activities. The solution was a layered system that began with linen braize, continued with wool leg wrappings or fitted trousers, and concluded with outer protection that varied based on conditions and availability of materials. Wool trousers were the standard middle layer, cut full enough to accommodate the base layer while remaining fitted enough to work under outer protection. For outer leg protection, Vikings used a variety of solutions that ranged from practical to ingenious. Leather leggings provided durability and water resistance, but required careful maintenance to prevent stiffening and cracking in extreme cold. Wool leg wrappings, essentially long strips of fabric wound around the legs from ankle to knee, offered flexibility and customizable insulation, but required skill to apply properly. Some Vikings used a combination approach, wearing fitted wool trousers with leather or fur leggings that could be removed when indoors or during less severe weather. Footwear represented perhaps the greatest challenge in Viking winter clothing because feet were constantly in contact with snow, ice, and wet ground while needing to remain functional for walking, working, and fighting. Vikings developed a multi-layered approach to foot protection that would be familiar to modern mountaineers: moisture, wicking inner layers, insulating middle layers, and waterproof outer protection. The inner layer typically consisted of wool socks or foot wrappings that absorbed moisture while maintaining warmth. These were often made from the finest, softest wool available because foot comfort was critical for mobility and health. Over the wool foot coverings, Vikings wore leather boots that were carefully constructed to provide both protection and flexibility. These weren't the crude hide wrappings that popular culture often depicts. Viking boots were sophisticated pieces of leatherwork with carefully designed soles, shaped uppers, and closure systems that balanced water resistance with the need for ventilation. The leather was treated with various oils and fats to maintain flexibility and water resistance, and the construction included features like reinforced heel and toe areas that extended the life of the boots under harsh conditions. For extreme conditions, Vikings added an outer layer of foot protection that might include fur-lined overboots, waterproof outer socks made from seal or fish skin, or even improvised protection made from whatever materials were available. The goal was always to maintain dry, warm feet, because frostbite in the extremities could quickly progress to life-threatening complications in an era before modern medical treatment. The art of Viking bedding represented another arena where their understanding of layering and insulation principles created solutions that modern camping enthusiasts study with admiration and occasional disbelief. Viking beds weren't just places to sleep. They were survival systems designed to maintain body heat through the long, dark hours when the fire had died down and the longhouse had grown cold enough to see your breath. The foundation of a Viking bed was typically a wooden frame that elevated the sleeping surface above the cold floor, creating an air gap that provided additional insulation. The mattress layer consisted of multiple elements designed to provide both comfort and thermal protection. The base was often a thick layer of straw or dried grass that provided cushioning while creating insulating air pockets. Over this went layers of wool fabric, often repurposed from worn-out clothing or blankets, that added both softness and warmth. The combination created a sleeping surface that was considerably more comfortable than modern people might expect, while providing insulation that could mean the difference between restful sleep and hypothermic death. Viking blankets were marvels of textile engineering designed to trap body heat while allowing moisture to escape. The best blankets were made from tightly woven wool that had been napped to create a fuzzy surface that trapped warm air close to the body. Multiple blankets were layered to create adjustable insulation lighter coverings for milder nights, additional layers when temperatures dropped to dangerous levels. The blankets were often constructed with overlapping edges and tuck-in features that prevented gaps where cold air could infiltrate the warm cocoon around the sleeper. For premium sleeping systems, Vikings used fur blankets and coverlets that provided ultimate insulation at the cost of considerable weight and expense. Bear furs were the ultimate luxury, providing warmth that could sustain life in conditions that would overwhelm wool blankets. Wolf and deer furs offered excellent insulation with less weight, while sheep and goat furs provided affordable options for households that couldn't afford exotic pelts. The furs were carefully prepared to maintain softness and insulation while preventing the kind of odor and pest problems that could make them unpleasant to live with in close quarters. The social aspects of bedding revealed how Viking sleeping arrangements balanced individual comfort with community warmth. Sharing beds and bedding wasn't just about saving space. It was about pooling body heat and resources to maximize survival chances. Family groups would arrange their sleeping areas to take advantage of shared warmth while maintaining enough individual space to prevent conflicts. The allocation of premium bedding materials like fur coverlets often reflected family hierarchies and social status within the household. Waterproofing represented one of the most sophisticated aspects of Viking clothing technology. requiring both chemical knowledge and practical skill to create garments that could repel water while remaining flexible and breathable. Vikings didn't have modern synthetic waterproofing compounds, but they developed techniques using natural materials that were remarkably effective. The foundation of Viking waterproofing was understanding which animal fats and oils provided the best protection for different types of materials under various conditions. Lanolin, the natural oil found in sheep's wool, provided the starting point for many Viking waterproofing treatments. By carefully extracting and concentrating lanolin, Vikings could create treatments that penetrated deeply into wool fibers, providing water repellency that lasted through multiple seasons of use. The process required patience and skill because too much lanolin made fabrics stiff and smelly, while too little provided inadequate protection. The best Viking waterproofing treatments achieved a balance that maintained fabric flexibility while creating a barrier that could turn aside everything from light rain to driving snow. For leather goods, Vikings used a variety of animal fats and oils that not only provided waterproofing, but also maintained the flexibility and durability of the leather. Seal oil was particularly prized for its water-repelling properties and long-lasting effectiveness, but it required access to marine mammals that wasn't available to all communities. Bear fat, deer fat, and even pig fat could be processed into effective leather treatments that provided protection while keeping the leather supple enough for comfortable wear. The maintenance and care of winter clothing represented a constant challenge that required both planning and daily attention. Vikings understood that clothing failure during winter could be fatal, so they developed systems for cleaning, repairing, and maintaining their garments that ensured maximum lifespan and effectiveness. Wool garments required careful washing techniques that cleaned without shrinking or damaging the fibers. Linen needed frequent washing to prevent the buildup of body oils and bacteria that could cause skin problems during long periods of continuous wear. Repair and patching of winter clothing became essential skills that every Viking household member needed to master. Torn garments couldn't simply be set aside until spring. They needed immediate attention to prevent small problems from becoming major failures. Vikings developed efficient patching techniques that restored both function and appearance to damaged clothing, often using contrasting fabrics in decorative patterns that turned necessary repairs into aesthetic features. The storage and preservation of winter clothing during summer months required careful planning to prevent damage from insects, moisture, and rodents. Vikings used various natural pest deterrents, including aromatic herbs and oils that kept moths and other fabric-damaging insects away from stored woolens. Proper storage also involved ensuring that clothing was clean and dry before being put away, preventing the kind of mold and mildew damage that could ruin garments during the months when they weren't needed. The economic aspects of Viking winter clothing revealed how significant clothing was as both a practical necessity and a form of wealth. High-quality winter garments represented substantial investments of time, materials, and skill that often took months or even years to complete. A full winter outfit for an adult, including multiple layers, footwear, and accessories, might represent the equivalent of several months' wages in a modern economy. This economic reality meant that clothing was carefully maintained, passed down through generations, and often modified and updated rather than replaced. The regional variations in Viking winter clothing reflected both the availability of different materials and the specific environmental challenges faced by communities in different geographic locations. Coastal Vikings had access to marine mammal furs and oils that provided superior waterproofing and insulation, while inland communities relied more heavily on sheep's wool and deer fur. These regional differences created trade networks where specialized clothing materials and techniques were exchanged between communities with complementary resources. The seasonal rhythm of clothing preparation became one of the major organizing principles of Viking domestic life. Summer months were devoted to shearing sheep, processing wool, hunting for fur-bearing animals, and gathering the materials needed for winter clothing production. Fall was the time for intensive garment construction, repair, and waterproofing treatments that would carry the household through the coming cold months. Winter brought daily maintenance and care activities that kept clothing functional through constant use under harsh conditions. Innovation in Viking clothing technology continued throughout the Viking Age as different communities developed solutions to specific challenges they faced. Improvements in spinning and weaving techniques created finer, warmer fabrics. New dyeing methods provided both aesthetic appeal and practical benefits, like improved fabric durability. Advances in leather working and fur preparation techniques created better outer layers that lasted longer and provided superior protection. The psychological aspects of Viking winter clothing were as important as the physical protection they provided. Well-made, attractive clothing provided confidence and social status that helped maintain morale during the challenging winter months. The bright colors and decorative elements of Viking garments served not just aesthetic purposes, but also psychological ones, providing visual warmth and beauty during the long dark months when the world outside was monochrome and hostile. Modern outdoor enthusiasts who spend hundreds of dollars on high-tech winter gear might be surprised to learn that Vikings achieved comparable or superior performance using nothing but animal and plant fibers, natural oils, and techniques passed down through generations of people who understood that clothing wasn't just fashion, it was survival technology. Their layering systems were so sophisticated that modern military and mountaineering organizations study Viking clothing techniques for insights into cold weather protection. The fundamental principles that Vikings mastered: moisture management, insulation layering, wind protection, and adaptability remain the foundation of modern cold weather clothing design. In an age when we complain about winter weather while wearing mass-produced synthetic fabrics and relying on heated cars and buildings, there's something both humbling and inspiring about the Viking approach to staying warm. They didn't just endure winter, they dressed for victory against it, creating clothing systems so effective that they supported entire communities through conditions that would challenge modern survival gear. Every wool fiber, every fur lining, every carefully applied waterproofing treatment was a quiet act of defiance against a world that seemed determined to freeze them solid. And somehow, wrapped in their layers of linen and wool, sealed inside their furs and leathers, Vikings not only survived the killing cold, they thrived in it, proving that sometimes the most sophisticated technology is the kind that comes from understanding nature well enough to turn it into clothing. If you think meal planning is stressful when you're trying to stretch groceries until payday, imagine the Vikings, who had to make 6 months of food last through a winter that could kill them if they miscalculated by even a few pounds of dried fish. While modern people panic about running out of milk and having to drink their coffee black, Vikings were performing complex mathematical equations involving salted meat, fermented vegetables, and the precise caloric needs of 30 people trapped in a wooden box for half the year. Their approach to food preservation wasn't meal prep, it was a desperate race against time, spoilage, and starvation, where one moldy barrel of grain could mean the difference between greeting spring as survivors or as very well-preserved corpses. The Viking relationship with food during winter was fundamentally different from anything modern people experience. We live in a world where food is available year-round, where seasonal variation means paying slightly more for strawberries in January rather than facing the prospect of slow death by malnutrition. Vikings faced the stark reality that from the first frost until the spring thaw, no new food would be produced, no crops would grow, and no fresh meat would be available except for the occasional desperate hunt through snow-covered forests. Everything they ate during those dark months had to be gathered, processed, and stored during the brief summer growing season, creating a logistical challenge that would overwhelm modern supply chain managers armed with computers and refrigerated transport. The foundation of Viking food preservation was salt, that miraculous mineral that transformed rotting meat into edible protein and turned the natural process of decay into an ally rather than an enemy. Salt wasn't just seasoning to Vikings, it was survival technology, as precious as any weapon and far more essential than gold. The chemistry of salt preservation, while not understood in modern scientific terms, was mastered through generations of trial and error that left little room for mistakes. Vikings learned that salt drew moisture from food, creating an environment where the bacteria responsible for spoilage couldn't survive, essentially mummifying meat and fish in a way that preserved nutritional value while extending shelf life indefinitely. The process of salt curing meat was a carefully orchestrated operation that began with the slaughter of livestock in late fall, when the cooling temperatures provided natural refrigeration and the animals had reached their maximum weight after a summer of grazing. This timing wasn't coincidental. Vikings understood that meat preservation required both the right environmental conditions and animals that had accumulated maximum fat reserves. The slaughter season was a community event where multiple households coordinated their activities to take advantage of shared labor and ensure that no meat was wasted during the critical preservation window. Beef and pork were the primary candidates for salt preservation, cut into strips and chunks that allowed salt to penetrate thoroughly, while creating pieces small enough to handle and cook efficiently. The meat was packed in layers with coarse salt, often mixed with herbs and spices that provided both flavor and additional preservative properties. Juniper berries, dill, and other aromatic plants weren't just culinary choices. They contained natural compounds that inhibited bacterial growth and helped prevent the kind of spoilage that could turn a winter's worth of protein into a toxic nightmare. The curing process required patience and expertise that came from understanding how different cuts of meat responded to salt treatment. Fatty cuts needed more salt and longer curing times, while lean meat could be preserved more quickly but required careful monitoring to prevent overcuring that made it tough and inedible. Vikings developed techniques for testing the progress of salt-cured meat that relied on touch, smell, and visual cues that told experienced preservers when the process was complete and the meat was ready for long-term storage. Fish preservation represented an even more sophisticated branch of Viking food technology, partly because fish was more abundant than meat in many regions, and partly because fish presented unique preservation challenges that required specialized techniques. The coastal location of many Viking communities provided access to vast quantities of fish during specific seasons, creating opportunities to accumulate protein reserves that could sustain entire villages through winter. But fish spoiled more quickly than meat and required immediate processing to prevent the kind of bacterial contamination that could ruin entire catches. Smoking emerged as the premier method for fish preservation, combining the dehydrating effects of heat with the antimicrobial properties of wood smoke to create a preservation environment that was both effective and practical. Viking smokehouses were carefully designed structures that controlled airflow, temperature, and smoke density to achieve optimal preservation results. The choice of wood for smoking wasn't arbitrary. Different woods produced different flavors and preservative effects. Oak provided a mild, sweet smoke that was ideal for delicate fish, while birch created a stronger, more intense smoke that worked well with fatty fish like salmon and herring. The smoking process itself was an art that required constant attention and adjustment based on weather conditions, fish size, and desired preservation levels. Cold smoking, performed at temperatures that preserved the fish without cooking it, created products that could be stored for months without refrigeration. Hot smoking produced fish that was ready to eat immediately but had a shorter storage life. Vikings mastered both techniques and used them strategically based on their immediate needs and long-term storage goals. Salting fish required different techniques than meat preservation because fish had different fat content and moisture levels that affected how salt penetrated and preserved the flesh. Vikings developed methods for dry salting fish that removed moisture while infusing the flesh with enough salt to prevent spoilage. The process began with cleaning and filleting the fish to expose maximum surface area to the salt, then packing the fillets in layers with coarse salt that drew out moisture and created a preservation brine. For fish that were too large for simple salting, Vikings used a combination approach that included initial salting, followed by air drying in controlled conditions that completed the preservation process. This technique, still used in modern Scandinavian cuisine, created products like stockfish that could be stored for years without spoilage while retaining most of their nutritional value. The dried fish became so hard they could be used as building materials, requiring soaking and careful preparation before consumption, but providing reliable protein when other sources weren't available. Fermentation represented perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Viking food preservation technology, requiring understanding of bacterial processes that wouldn't be scientifically explained for centuries after the Viking Age ended. Vikings discovered that controlled bacterial fermentation could preserve vegetables, dairy products, and even meat in ways that not only prevented spoilage, but actually improved nutritional value and digestibility. The fermentation process created acidic environments that prevented harmful bacteria from growing while producing foods that could be stored without salt or smoking. Sauerkraut and other fermented vegetables became staples of Viking winter nutrition, providing essential vitamins and minerals that prevented scurvy and other nutritional deficiency diseases. The fermentation process was surprisingly simple in concept, but required precise execution to achieve proper results. Vegetables were chopped, salted, and packed in containers where beneficial bacteria could work without interference from harmful organisms. The key was creating anaerobic conditions that favored the right bacteria while preventing exposure to air that could introduce spoilage organisms. Fermented dairy products represented another crucial component of Viking food preservation strategy, transforming perishable milk into products that could be stored for extended periods while providing essential proteins and fats. Vikings developed techniques for making various fermented milk products that served different nutritional and storage needs. Skyr, a fermented dairy product that was somewhere between yogurt and cheese, provided concentrated protein that could be stored for months without refrigeration. The fermentation process not only preserved the milk, but also broke down proteins and fats in ways that made them easier to digest during the stress of winter survival. The production of fermented dairy products required careful management of bacterial cultures that Vikings maintained from season to season, passing starter cultures between households and preserving them through techniques that kept the beneficial bacteria alive and active. This represented a sophisticated understanding of biological processes that allowed Vikings to essentially domesticate bacteria for food preservation purposes, creating living preservation systems that could be maintained and propagated year after year. Grain storage presented unique challenges that required different approaches than meat or dairy preservation. Grains were the foundation of Viking winter nutrition, providing the carbohydrates that supplied energy for winter activities and the bulk that made limited protein supplies stretch further. But grains were vulnerable to moisture, insects, and rodents that could destroy entire winter food supplies if storage systems failed. Vikings developed storage techniques that protected grain from all these threats while keeping it accessible for daily use throughout the winter months. Underground storage pits lined with stones and sealed with waterproof materials created environments that maintained stable temperatures and moisture levels while protecting grain from surface threats. These storage systems were carefully engineered to prevent water infiltration while allowing for ventilation that prevented the buildup of moisture that could cause spoilage. The pits were often constructed with drainage systems that carried away any water that did penetrate the storage area, ensuring that even during wet weather, the grain remained dry and usable. Above-ground storage required different techniques that focused on creating containers and storage areas that were secure from pests while remaining accessible during winter weather. Vikings built storage buildings and created large containers that could hold substantial quantities of grain while providing protection from moisture and animals. These storage systems often included features like raised floors that prevented ground moisture from reaching the grain and tight-fitting lids that kept out insects and rodents. The challenge of protecting stored grain from insects required techniques that modern pest control specialists would recognize and appreciate. Vikings used a variety of natural pest deterrents, including aromatic herbs and plants, that repelled insects without contaminating the grain. They also developed storage techniques that minimized insect access, using containers and storage methods that created barriers against infestation. Some Viking storage systems included features like oil-filled moats around storage containers that prevented crawling insects from reaching the grain. Rationing represented perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of Viking winter food management, requiring families and communities to balance current nutritional needs against uncertain future availability. The mathematics of rationing were brutal and unforgiving. Too generous with food early in winter, and you starved later. Too conservative, and you weakened yourself when you needed strength to survive the harshest months. Vikings developed rationing systems that allocated food based on age, gender, work requirements, and social status, creating hierarchies of food distribution that ensured survival of the most essential community members, even when total food supplies were insufficient for everyone. The psychological pressure of rationing created social tensions that required careful management to prevent the kind of conflicts that could destroy community cohesion when cooperation was essential for survival. Vikings developed social mechanisms for handling food distribution disputes and created systems of accountability that ensured rationing decisions were fair and transparent. The communal nature of much food storage meant that rationing decisions affected entire communities and required consensus building that balanced individual needs against group survival. Seasonal variation in rationing reflected the changing nutritional and caloric needs of winter survival. Early winter rationing was often more generous, allowing people to maintain strength and body weight that would be crucial during the harshest months. Midwinter rationing became more stringent as food supplies dwindled and the realization set in that spring was still months away. Late winter rationing was often desperate, with communities stretching minimal remaining supplies while watching for the first signs of spring that would bring new food sources. The role of fat in Viking winter nutrition was understood and managed with sophistication that modern nutritionists would appreciate. Vikings recognized that fat provided concentrated calories that were essential for maintaining body heat and energy during winter months, when caloric requirements increased dramatically. Animal fat was carefully preserved and rationed as a premium food source that could provide twice as many calories per pound as protein or carbohydrates. Vikings developed techniques for rendering, storing, and consuming fats that maximized their nutritional benefit while making them palatable throughout the winter months. Emergency food sources represented the last line of defense against starvation when regular food supplies were exhausted or compromised. Vikings identified and prepared backup food sources that could sustain life when conventional foods weren't available. These emergency foods included tree bark that could be ground into flour, various roots and tubers that could be stored underground, and even leather goods that could be boiled into edible but unpalatable protein sources. The knowledge of emergency food sources was carefully maintained and passed down through generations because the ability to identify and use these resources could mean the difference between survival and death during particularly harsh winters. Food preparation during winter required techniques that maximized nutritional value while conserving fuel and cooking materials. Vikings developed cooking methods that could transform preserved foods into palatable meals without requiring excessive amounts of precious firewood. Stews and soups became staples of winter cooking because they could combine small amounts of preserved meat with grains and vegetables to create filling, nutritious meals that stretched limited protein supplies. The liquid from these preparations also provided hydration and helped the body absorb nutrients more efficiently. The social aspects of food sharing and communal eating became crucial elements of Viking winter survival that went beyond simple nutrition. Shared meals provided opportunities for community bonding, information exchange, and morale maintenance that were essential for psychological survival during the long dark months. The ritual of communal eating helped maintain social structures and provided frameworks for addressing conflicts and making decisions that affected the entire community. Food-related diseases and nutritional deficiencies posed constant threats that Vikings learned to prevent and manage through dietary strategies that maintained health even when food variety was limited. Scurvy prevention required ensuring that winter diets included preserved foods that retained vitamin C, particularly fermented vegetables and certain preserved fruits. Vikings also learned to recognize and treat the symptoms of various nutritional deficiencies using whatever foods and remedies were available during winter months. The economic aspects of food preservation and storage represented major investments that required careful planning and resource allocation. The materials and labor required for food preservation activities represented significant portions of household budgets and community resources. Salt, smoking materials, storage containers, and preservation equipment all required acquisition and maintenance that competed with other survival needs. Vikings developed economic strategies that balanced food security against other necessities, creating systems that ensured adequate food preservation without bankrupting households or communities. Innovation in food preservation techniques continued throughout the Viking Age as different communities developed solutions to specific challenges they faced. Improvements in smoking techniques created better preservation with less fuel consumption. New fermentation methods produced foods with longer storage lives and better nutritional profiles. Advances in storage technology reduced losses to spoilage and pest damage while making stored foods more accessible during winter months. The seasonal rhythm of food preservation activities became one of the major organizing principles of Viking agricultural and domestic life. Spring brought planning for the coming year's food preservation activities and assessment of storage facilities that needed repair or improvement. Summer was devoted to intensive food production and the beginning of preservation activities for early crops and dairy products. Fall brought the culmination of preservation activities with the processing of grain harvests, meat from slaughtered livestock, and final preparations for winter storage. Regional variations in food preservation reflected both the availability of different food sources and the specific environmental challenges faced by communities in different geographic locations. Coastal communities specialized in fish preservation and developed techniques that maximized the use of marine food sources. Inland communities focused more heavily on meat and grain preservation, while developing trading relationships that provided access to preserved fish and other coastal foods. These regional differences created trade networks where specialized preserved foods were exchanged between communities with complementary resources. The legacy of Viking food preservation techniques influenced Scandinavian cuisine for centuries after the Viking Age ended and continues to shape modern Nordic food culture. Many traditional preservation methods developed by Vikings remained in use well into the modern era and experienced revivals as people rediscovered the effectiveness and flavor benefits of traditional preservation techniques. The fundamental principles of preservation that Vikings mastered: salt curing, smoking, fermentation, and controlled storage remain the foundation of food preservation technology, even in the age of mechanical refrigeration. Modern food security experts studying emergency preparedness and sustainable food systems often examine Viking preservation techniques for insights into low-technology solutions that remain effective without modern infrastructure. The Viking approach to food preservation demonstrated that sophisticated food security systems could be created using only natural materials and techniques that required no external energy sources beyond human labor and natural environmental conditions. Today, when modern people worry about power outages affecting their freezers or supply chain disruptions limiting food availability, it's worth remembering the Vikings, who faced 6 months of complete food production shutdown with nothing but their preserved foods and carefully calculated rationing systems. They didn't just survive winter, they created food preservation and management systems so effective that they supported entire communities through conditions that would challenge modern food distribution networks. Every piece of salt fish, every barrel of fermented vegetables, every carefully rationed portion was a quiet victory against a world that seemed determined to starve them into submission. And somehow, armed with nothing but salt, smoke, and an intimate understanding of how to make food last when failure meant death, Vikings not only made it through winter after winter, they thrived well enough to launch raids, build communities, and create a culture that we still study with admiration nearly 1,000 years later. If you think being stuck in lockdown with your family was psychologically challenging, spare a thought for the Vikings, who voluntarily trapped themselves in wooden boxes with 30 to 50 relatives, neighbors, and livestock for 6 months of unrelenting darkness, and somehow managed to emerge in spring, still speaking to each other, instead of having committed elaborate murders involving fishing nets and butter churns. While modern people complain about Zoom fatigue after a few hours of virtual meetings, Vikings faced the ultimate test of human social engineering, maintaining community cohesion, individual sanity, and collective morale when escape was impossible, privacy was non-existent, and the alternative to getting along was freezing to death in a snowbank while your former neighbors watched from their cozy longhouse windows. The psychological challenges of Viking winter survival went far beyond the obvious problems of cold, hunger, and physical discomfort. The human mind, evolved for movement, variety, and natural light cycles, was forced to adapt to conditions that seemed specifically designed to drive people insane. Months of near-total darkness, confinement in spaces that wouldn't meet modern fire codes, and social interaction limited to the same faces day after day until you could probably identify your neighbor's breathing patterns from across the room. Modern research on seasonal depression, cabin fever, and isolation stress would suggest that Viking winter survival should have been a psychological catastrophe that left entire communities as dysfunctional wrecks come spring. Instead, Vikings not only maintained their sanity, they used the forced isolation as an opportunity to strengthen community bonds, preserve cultural knowledge, and engage in activities that actually enhanced their society's resilience and creativity. The foundation of Viking psychological survival was storytelling, an art form that transformed the brutally boring reality of winter confinement into a rich landscape of adventure, wisdom, and shared imagination. Viking storytelling wasn't passive entertainment like modern television. It was interactive performance art that required participation, memory, and creativity from everyone in the longhouse. The stories weren't just ways to pass time, they were survival technology, as essential as food preservation or fire management, providing the mental stimulation and cultural continuity that kept communities psychologically intact through the endless dark months. The oral tradition that sustained Viking winters was sophisticated beyond anything most modern people can imagine. In a culture without books, movies, or recorded music, human memory became the repository of all knowledge, entertainment, and cultural wisdom. Viking storytellers, known as skalds, weren't just entertainers. They were living libraries who carried entire civilizations' worth of knowledge in their heads. These men and women memorized thousands of stories, poems, genealogies, laws, and historical accounts with accuracy that would shame modern scholars armed with digital databases and fact-checking software. The evening storytelling sessions that unfolded around the central hearth were carefully orchestrated events that served multiple functions beyond simple entertainment. Stories transmitted practical knowledge about navigation, weather prediction, animal behavior, and survival techniques in formats that were memorable and engaging. Historical tales preserved family lineages, political alliances, and territorial claims that had legal and social significance. Religious stories maintained spiritual beliefs and provided frameworks for understanding the harsh realities of existence in an unforgiving world. But storytelling also served crucial psychological functions that kept individuals and communities mentally healthy during the isolation of winter. Stories provided vicarious adventure and excitement that compensated for the monotony of daily winter life. They created shared emotional experiences that bonded listeners together in ways that mere conversation couldn't achieve. The act of telling and retelling stories gave people active roles in preserving and shaping their culture, providing a sense of purpose and accomplishment that combat the depression and listlessness that could result from months of enforced inactivity. The competitive aspects of Viking storytelling revealed how these communities channeled potentially destructive social tensions into constructive activities. Storytelling contests became elaborate social events where individuals competed to tell the most entertaining, educational, or memorable tales. These competitions weren't just fun and games. They served as pressure release valves that allowed people to compete and show off without resorting to violence or conflict that could tear apart the community cooperation essential for survival. A well-told story could earn social status, respect, and remembered admiration that lasted long beyond the winter months. The collaborative nature of Viking storytelling created opportunities for entire communities to participate in creative activities that kept minds active and engaged. Stories were often told in rounds, with different people contributing different parts or perspectives on the same tale. This collaborative approach meant that even people who weren't natural storytellers could participate by adding details, asking questions, or suggesting plot developments. The stories themselves evolved through this collaborative process, with each telling potentially adding new elements that reflected the current concerns and interests of the community. Productive work activities represented another crucial component of Viking psychological survival, providing purpose, accomplishment, and mental stimulation that prevented the kind of listlessness and depression that could result from months of forced inactivity. Vikings understood that idle hands and minds were dangerous during winter confinement, so they organized work activities that kept everyone busy while producing useful goods and maintaining essential skills. The Longhouse during winter became a combined workshop, school, and social center where multiple generations worked together on projects that benefited the entire community. Textile production was perhaps the most important winter work activity, providing both practical necessities and engaging mental challenges that could occupy skilled workers for months. The process of spinning wool into yarn required attention and skill, but allowed for conversation and social interaction, making it ideal for the social dynamics of winter confinement. Weaving was more complex and demanding, requiring concentration and expertise that provided mental stimulation while producing fabrics essential for clothing, bedding, and trade goods. The collaborative nature of textile work meant that experienced workers could teach younger community members while everyone contributed to essential production activities. Woodworking and crafts provided opportunities for more specialized skilled workers to continue practicing their trades while producing goods that would be needed for spring activities. Carving, carpentry, and tool-making required concentration and skill that provided mental engagement while creating useful products. These activities also served educational functions, allowing master craftsmen to pass on techniques and knowledge to younger workers who might not have opportunities for such intensive training during the busy summer months. Weapon and tool maintenance represented essential work that kept everyone's survival equipment in optimal condition while providing purposeful activity during the winter months. Sharpening blades, repairing handles, and maintaining metal components required skill and attention that provided mental stimulation, while ensuring that essential tools would be ready for spring activities. This maintenance work also served social functions, as people shared techniques and competed to produce the best-maintained equipment. The management of social dynamics within the confined space of a winter longhouse required sophisticated systems for preventing and resolving conflicts that could destroy community cohesion when cooperation was essential for survival. Vikings developed formal and informal mechanisms for handling disputes, maintaining order, and ensuring that the stress of confinement didn't explode into violence that could be fatal for everyone involved. The social hierarchy that existed during summer months became even more important during winter, when clear leadership and decision-making authority could prevent minor disagreements from escalating into community-destroying conflicts. The allocation of space, resources, and responsibilities within the longhouse required careful management that balanced individual needs against community survival. The most desirable sleeping spots near the central fire were typically assigned based on age, family status, and social rank, creating hierarchies that everyone understood and accepted. Work assignments were distributed to ensure that essential tasks were completed while giving everyone productive activities that contributed to community survival. Even seemingly minor decisions about food distribution, work schedules, and social activities required careful consideration of how they would affect group dynamics and individual morale. Conflict resolution mechanisms ranged from formal judicial procedures for serious disputes to informal mediation and social pressure for minor disagreements. The confined space of the longhouse meant that conflicts couldn't be resolved through physical separation or avoidance, so Vikings developed sophisticated techniques for addressing grievances and restoring social harmony. These conflict resolution systems weren't just practical necessities, they were survival tools that prevented the kind of community breakdown that could be fatal during winter months when cooperation was essential. Games and entertainment provided crucial outlets for competitive instincts and social energy that could become destructive if not properly channeled. Vikings developed a variety of games that could be played indoors with limited space and materials, ranging from board games that required strategy and skill to physical contests that provided exercise and excitement. These games weren't just pastimes. They served important psychological and social functions that helped maintain community cohesion and individual mental health during the long months of confinement. Board games like Nefertafel, a strategic game that resembled chess, provided mental challenges that kept minds sharp while creating opportunities for social interaction and friendly competition. These games could occupy hours of time while requiring concentration and skill that provided mental stimulation. The competitive aspects of gaming created socially acceptable ways for people to compete and establish status without resorting to conflicts that could damage community relationships. Physical games and contests provided exercise and excitement that helped combat the physical deterioration that could result from months of reduced activity. Wrestling matches, strength contests, and agility challenges gave people opportunities to stay physically active while providing entertainment for spectators. These physical activities also served social functions, allowing individuals to demonstrate prowess and maintain respect within the community hierarchy. Gambling and betting added excitement to games and contests while creating economic activities that redistributed resources and provided additional motivation for participation. The stakes weren't usually high enough to create serious financial hardship, but they added psychological interest that made games more engaging and competitive. Gambling also created opportunities for social interaction and negotiation that helped maintain the interpersonal skills that were essential for community cooperation. Religious and spiritual practices provided frameworks for understanding and coping with the psychological stresses of winter survival, while maintaining cultural identity and community cohesion. Viking spiritual beliefs weren't just abstract theology, they were practical psychology that helped people find meaning and purpose in the harsh realities of winter existence. Religious observances, rituals, and celebrations provided structure to the long winter months while creating shared experiences that bonded communities together. The winter solstice and other seasonal celebrations became focal points that divided the long winter into manageable segments while providing anticipated events that maintained morale and gave people something to look forward to. These celebrations weren't just parties, they were psychological necessities that marked the passage of time and provided hope that spring would eventually return. The preparation for religious celebrations also provided purposeful activities that kept people engaged and gave them reasons to create special foods, decorations, and entertainment. Spiritual practices also provided individual coping mechanisms that helped people deal with the stress, anxiety, and depression that could result from winter confinement. Prayer, meditation, and religious observance gave individuals ways to process their emotions and find meaning in their suffering. The belief systems that supported these practices provided explanatory frameworks that helped people understand their hardships as part of larger cosmic purposes rather than random suffering. The role of alcohol in Viking winter survival was more complex and important than simple recreational drinking. Fermented beverages like mead and ale weren't just luxuries, they were tools for managing social dynamics, celebrating important events, and providing psychological relief from the stresses of confinement. The social consumption of alcohol created opportunities for bonding and celebration that helped maintain community morale, while the mild intoxication provided temporary escape from the psychological pressures of winter survival. Brewing and fermentation activities provided productive work that kept people engaged while creating beverages that served important social and psychological functions. The process of brewing required skill and attention that provided mental stimulation while producing products that enhanced social activities and celebrations. The availability of alcoholic beverages also created opportunities for trade and gift-giving that maintained social relationships and provided markers of hospitality and generosity. The controlled consumption of alcohol during winter celebrations and social events served important functions in releasing social tensions and providing psychological relief from the stresses of confinement. These drinking sessions weren't just parties, they were carefully managed social events that allowed people to relax, socialize, and bond in ways that everyday interactions couldn't achieve. The temporary alteration of consciousness that alcohol provided also gave people brief escapes from the psychological pressures of survival concerns. Music and artistic expression provided additional outlets for creativity and emotional release that were essential for maintaining psychological health during winter confinement. Viking musical traditions included both instrumental music and vocal performances that served entertainment, religious, and social functions. The creation and performance of music provided opportunities for individual expression and creativity, while creating shared experiences that bonded communities together. Singing, in particular, became an important winter activity that provided both entertainment and practical benefits. Group singing created shared emotional experiences that helped maintain community bonds, while the physical act of singing provided exercise and stress relief. The memorization and performance of songs also served educational functions, transmitting cultural knowledge and historical information in memorable formats. Solo singing gave individuals opportunities for personal expression and creativity that helped maintain individual identity and mental health during the social pressures of community living. Musical instruments, when available, provided additional opportunities for artistic expression and entertainment. Simple instruments like flutes, drums, and stringed instruments could be played in the confined spaces of longhouses while providing music for dancing, singing, and celebration. The creation and maintenance of musical instruments also provided productive work activities that kept skilled craftsmen engaged while creating tools for community entertainment. Dance, despite the space limitations of longhouse living, provided physical exercise and emotional expression that were important for maintaining psychological health. Even simple movements and rhythmic activities provided opportunities for physical expression and stress relief that helped combat the mental and physical stagnation that could result from months of confinement. Group dances created shared physical experiences that bonded participants together while providing exercise and entertainment. The leadership and organization required to maintain community cohesion during winter months revealed sophisticated systems of governance and social management that kept groups functioning effectively under extreme stress. Winter leadership required different skills than summer activities like raiding or farming, focusing more on diplomatic abilities, conflict resolution, and morale maintenance than military prowess or agricultural expertise. The leaders who emerged during winter months were often different from the dominant figures of summer activities, reflecting the different challenges and priorities of survival versus expansion. Decision-making processes during winter required balancing individual needs against community survival while maintaining the democratic traditions that characterized many Viking communities. The confined conditions of winter living meant that major decisions affected everyone directly and immediately, requiring consensus building and consultation that took into account the opinions and needs of all community members. These decision-making processes weren't just practical necessities, they were psychological tools that gave people agency and participation in their survival efforts. The distribution of authority and responsibility during winter months required careful balancing of experience, expertise, and social status to ensure that essential tasks were completed while maintaining community harmony. Different aspects of winter survival required different types of expertise, from food management to conflict resolution to entertainment organization. The recognition and utilization of these different skills provided opportunities for various community members to take leadership roles and contribute to group survival in ways that maintained their sense of worth and purpose. Mental health management, while not understood in modern psychological terms, was addressed through various practices and social mechanisms that Vikings developed to cope with the psychological challenges of winter survival. The recognition that isolation, darkness, and confinement could affect mental state led to community practices that provided support, distraction, and treatment for individuals who were struggling with the psychological pressures of winter life. These mental health interventions weren't formal medical treatments, but they were effective community responses to the predictable psychological challenges of winter survival. The identification and support of individuals who were struggling with depression, anxiety, or other mental health challenges required community awareness and intervention strategies that prevented individual problems from becoming community crises. The confined nature of longhouse living meant that mental health problems couldn't be hidden or ignored, so communities developed ways to provide support and treatment that helped individuals cope while protecting the group from the potentially disruptive effects of untreated mental health issues. Social support systems provided networks of relationships and assistance that helped individuals cope with the stresses of winter survival while maintaining their sense of connection and purpose within the community. These support systems weren't just informal friendships, they were structured relationships that provided practical assistance, emotional support, and social integration that helped people maintain their mental health during challenging periods. The seasonal patterns of mental health challenges required community strategies that anticipated and prepared for the predictable, psychological difficulties that arose during different phases of winter. Early winter brought anxiety about whether food supplies and preparations would be adequate for survival. Midwinter brought depression and listlessness from months of darkness and confinement. Late winter brought desperation and conflict as resources dwindled and spring seemed impossibly far away. Community responses to these seasonal challenges reflected sophisticated understanding of how environmental conditions affected human psychology and behavior. Innovation in social activities and community building continued throughout the winter months as communities developed new ways to maintain morale, provide entertainment, and strengthen social bonds. These innovations weren't just creative responses to boredom, they were survival adaptations that helped communities function more effectively under extreme conditions. The social technologies that Vikings developed during winter months often proved valuable during summer activities as well, creating stronger and more cohesive communities that could respond more effectively to various challenges. The development of new games, entertainment forms, and social activities provided opportunities for creativity and innovation that kept communities dynamic and engaged, rather than simply enduring winter survival. These innovations reflected the Viking understanding that survival required more than just meeting basic physical needs. It required maintaining the social and psychological conditions that made survival worthwhile and sustainable over multiple seasons. Educational activities during winter months provided opportunities for knowledge, transfer, and skill development that strengthened communities while providing purposeful activities for both teachers and students. The extended periods of indoor time created ideal conditions for intensive instruction in various skills and knowledge areas that couldn't be taught as effectively during the busy summer months. These educational activities weren't just practical training, they were community investments in long-term survival and prosperity. The legacy of Viking community survival strategies influenced social practices and community organization in Northern European societies for centuries after the Viking Age ended. Many of the social technologies that Vikings developed for winter survival proved valuable for other situations that required community cooperation under stress. The storytelling traditions, conflict resolution mechanisms, and community organization systems that sustained Viking winter survival became templates for social organization that continued to shape Scandinavian culture long after the environmental pressures that created them had been reduced by technological advances. Modern researchers studying community resilience, disaster psychology, and social survival often examine Viking winter practices for insights into how human groups can maintain cohesion and effectiveness under extreme stress. The Viking approach to community survival demonstrated that social and psychological survival were as important as physical survival, and that communities that invested in maintaining morale, resolving conflicts, and providing meaning could not only survive extreme conditions, but emerge stronger and more cohesive than they were before the crisis. The seasonal cycle of community life that Vikings developed around winter survival created rhythms of social interaction and community building that enhanced the effectiveness of their societies during all seasons. The intensive community bonding that occurred during winter months created social capital that could be drawn upon during summer activities like raiding, trading, and exploration. The conflict resolution skills and social management techniques that were essential for winter survival proved valuable for managing the social challenges of other high-stress activities. Contemporary studies of seasonal affective disorder, cabin fever, and isolation psychology provide scientific validation for many of the community survival strategies that Vikings developed through practical experience. The emphasis on social interaction, productive activity, creative expression, and community celebration that characterized Viking winter practices align closely with modern psychological recommendations for maintaining mental health during periods of isolation and environmental stress. Today, when modern people struggle with the psychological challenges of temporary isolation or seasonal depression despite having electric lights, climate control, and global communication networks, there's something both humbling and inspiring about the Viking approach to community survival. They didn't just endure months of darkness and confinement, they created social technologies so sophisticated that they transformed survival conditions into opportunities for cultural enrichment, community building, and individual growth. Every shared story, every collaborative work session, every carefully managed celebration was a quiet victory against a world that seemed designed to drive them apart and break them down. And somehow, trapped together in their smoky wooden boxes while winter raged outside, Vikings not only maintained their sanity and social bonds, they created communities so strong and cohesive that they could emerge from months of survival mode, ready to sail across oceans, build new settlements, and create a cultural legacy that still captures our imagination more than 1,000 years later.